I'm the president of Liftport Group. Um, a bunch of things are going on right now, so I'm going to try to make this a little bit briefer than our normal show, only because there's some pretty cool stuff going on, and I want to make sure that I get to it all. Um, First, a little bit of a recap. Um, I, I think if you've been watching in the last week or so, you might have seen that we've been doing a lot of Martian coverage. Now, Martian stuff is not our normal topic, but I think you all know that we host the Red Planet Live show for the Mars Society and also the Pioneers of Commercial Space for the Space Frontier Foundation. And last week we had a really big announcement. We hosted a really big announcement for the Mars Society, their new program called Mars Technology Institute. I talked a lot about that on Monday, so I'm not going to dig deep into that. But if that's something you're interested in, I really encourage you to take a look both at our show that we did on Monday, where I gave my own impressions and my own ideas, and then also the show that we hosted on Wednesday last week, where GeekWire and the journalist Alan Boyle covered the Mars Society's big presentation. So we're still doing a lot of stuff with Mars. Our company is going down to Arizona State University in about 2.5 weeks to help the Mars Society put on their annual conference. So we're gonna be off air for a couple days probably to help with that. So definitely Monday and Wednesday, and then maybe one other day. Although we are trying to find an alternative for some other content. So lots going on, big stuff going on. I'm a big fan of Mars Technology Institute, and I talked a lot about that on Monday. Um, but I'm gonna move on to kind of our regularly scheduled programming and go kind of back on script today. Um, as you may know, we've been doing these shows since October last year, so coming up on a year, so that's pretty exciting. Um, we also discovered today that we have a 3-year anniversary that almost went completely missed. So I'll talk about that in a moment. So interesting anniversaries for us. Um, uh, we have three kind of shows. We have a news program where we kind of dig into all the current events. I considered doing that one today, but I'd rather focus on some policy stuff. There are some pretty interesting current events, so I'll touch on that briefly. Today is going to be a policy deep dive. We're going to kind of take a look at some documents and give some historic and some context to this stuff. And then we often have a guest on our show. We're going to have some guests lined up. I have a bunch of stuff lined up, but it's going to be a little while. Probably that's next week or the week after that. And then we have something new that relates to the anniversary that we'll talk about here in a moment. We focus our shows always around that intersection of policy, national policy, infrastructure. What are we building up there? What are we actually going to build in space? And money, right? Money, policy, and infrastructure. How much does it cost? What are we going to build? And who's going to support it? So that's been our show for a long time. The DareGreatly podcast can be found on our YouTube channel, Liftport, youtube.com/Liftport. Hundreds of really terrific interviews and shows there. So definitely want you to check that out. And then also recently on Spotify, we've got about I think we're probably close to 30 episodes posted there now. So take a look at Spotify. Specifically, you're going to have to search for Dare Greatly. There are several Dare Greatly shows. So you're going to look for Dare Greatly space. And with that, I'm going to move a little bit to some of the anniversaries. So about 3 years ago, during the middle of the pandemic, we were faced with shutting down the company. And if you know anything about our history, we already shut it down back in 2007. We shut it down again. So 2003, 4, 5, 6, and 7. We had another small version of the company in 2012 into 13 and got shut down again for lack of money. The first time for economic reasons, mostly dealing with the real estate collapses. But we started again in 2017 and 18, and I really didn't want to close the company again. That would be pretty hard. So we wound up making some unexpected pivots away from doing hardware research and focused on the moon. We still do that, but starting to do online conferences as a service. Started out as a favor to a friend. And that kept us in business throughout most of the pandemic. And that also led to this show, to the series of podcasts that we've been doing. We're coming up on some anniversaries. The very first show that we did, it turns out it was September 26th, 2020. And it was focused on a space policy topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I won't go into details on it, but the short version is the philosophy that was going to guide the Pentagon and the development of Space Force. So it's a pretty interesting show, pretty well attended. It remains one of my favorites. And that was the beginning of us doing conferences. That was the beginning of us doing online shows, the beginning of us doing these kinds of podcasts. All that started 3 years ago. And so we kind of took that out of the box this morning with the team and started saying, okay, what can we do around that? That show was really focused on not just space policy, but it's called space power projection. There's a lot of stuff on this, but how do we use space as a national security tool to push the American agenda out into the world, and in this case, beyond the world? It has its roots in naval force projection. Some of you know I'm a former U.S. Marine, so I know a tiny bit about that stuff. I certainly like the history of it. But this new thinking behind space force projection is new, and it's kind of revolutionary, and I think it's really important. So we did this show 3 years ago where it was basically a debate between what I consider old way of thinking about space and the new way of thinking about space. Spoiler alert, the old way won, so we haven't been able to break that barrier yet. But it got us thinking this morning when we were kind of brainstorming about what happens next for us, for our team, for our company. And we're going to start building out a dedicated space defense topic. We're not sure how that's going to play out just yet, but we are really committed to it. All of the team is excited about it. And it will kind of coincide with our anniversary of 3 years, because that was our first topic. So that should be kind of interesting. I'm kind of excited about that. More on that later as it gets kind of fleshed out and some meat on the bone there. But I have said since before there was a Space Force, when it was still being batted around at the end of the Obama administration, calling it Space Corps. I've been supporting this idea since its earliest stages. Um, I was asked, but then did not get to give congressional testimony on the topic. So I've been a fan of it for a long time. I'm a big supporter. And we're going to start dedicating some of our core internal resources to building out some new focus content on the military side of space. Um, okay, with that, I'm going to switch kind of to our normal programming here. I'm going to point out just a few pieces of interesting news. Give me a second. Let me pull this up here. I don't know which is more embarrassing, that I heard about and investigated this nonsense about you know, some random researcher gave testimony to the Mexican Congress about a potential um, two alien bodies that he found. The whole thing looks ridiculous to me, absolutely ridiculous. But I fell for it, and that pulled me into Twitter. And when I got bored looking at the nonsense, I actually start looking at space news. And this article, this is from Payload. Jack Kerr is a writer for Payload. Um, he's talking about a Wall Street Journal article, which has a paywall, so I can't really get there, can't really see what it says, and I'm not willing to pay for it. So um, he summarizes a piece I think is really interesting. Um, Subscriptions for Starlink will hit 2.5 million. That'll generate about 5 billion in U.S. revenues, in U.S. dollars, in 2023. And quote, getting to 12 billion of Starlink revenue is likely only a couple years away. I'm going to say that again because I stuttered there. Getting to 12 billion of Starlink revenues is likely only within a couple years. The total addressable market can support the growth. That is pretty remarkable. 12 billion in revenue for that company would be pretty astounding. SpaceX has surpassed 5,000 active satellites. And think about this, that organization sprang out of nothing in 2018. They didn't have any satellites. So pretty remarkable growth. 5 billion in revenue off of 5,000 satellites. That is a pretty high return on investment per satellite. So pretty cool stuff. I'm a pretty big fan of Starship and Starlink. Typically not a fan of Elon Musk directly. I always find it ironic that I'm using his service of the app that was formerly known as Twitter to get data on Starlink. That's not lost on me. So I find that a little bit entertaining. Let me post this link here for folks. Okay. Sticking with Payload for a moment, and this is what we're going to talk about most of the rest of the program, is This article, a new plan for space to be treated like other infrastructure. Um, this is an icon of the space community, Spaceport America. For better or for worse, a lot of money got dumped into that project in the middle of nowhere, New Mexico. Um, I've been out there before this site was built. It's pretty interesting. It's very empty out there, so it's strange to see this structure just existing in the middle of nowhere out there. Um, uh, with any good luck, it will be a thriving site for space. For a long time, it was the headquarters of Virgin. So I think it will still continue, and fingers crossed that Virgin is able to kind of get out of the doldrums that they're in and actually start hitting some of the milestones. But that wasn't the point of this topic. The topic is space to be treated like other infrastructure. So the AIAA's Cislunar Ecosystem Task Force just released a paper called Project Clarity. And that white paper deals with how to um, take existing infrastructure elements like airports, seaports, and highways and apply those tools and rules to space projects. That is pretty cool. That is pretty ambitious. We in this industry have certainly been pushing that for a long time. The Foundation for the Future was looking for that almost 3 years ago. Um, Workforce development, infrastructure development. So it's pretty neat to see that that is maybe starting to happen. It's definitely happening differently than we expected 3 years ago, but I'm going to remain optimistic. But I wanted to kind of look into this infrastructure element a little bit further. Um, uh, there's something else I wanted to talk about here. Um, oh, this was nice. When they were presenting this to the National Space Council, quote, uh, they expected us, I think, to start talking about how the government is not doing enough. He said, we didn't have that view. Our view is that the government had all the resources it needed. What it did need was clarity. So that's why they named the Project Clarity. And that's what they're saying. And I'll talk about that when we do a deeper dive into the document here in a moment. Um, uh, they want what the AIAA did was they released a white paper. A white paper does not have weight in the government. It's just somebody who has a really good idea that does the work to put together this, their thoughts on paper. And then the next step is to take it to other organizations that will use that white paper as an influence policy. So we're going to talk about that white paper here in a moment. I'm going to pull up a different version of this, so just bear with me. But this is the document that we're going to be talking about. And the link is here. Give me a second. We're going to go into this a little bit more, but I wanted to dig into something before I do that. So there has been, let me get to it. Yeah, here we go. There has been this idea of critical infrastructure. what is critical infrastructure? I'm going to post some links here. As defined by the U.S. government. Uh, this is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Um, I have known this organization existed, but it's only way, way off out of my peripheral vision. It is not a thing I think about very much. But this website is worth digging into. It is worth looking at this and try to understand who is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Their role provides guidance to support state, local, and industry partners in identifying the critical infrastructure sectors and essential workers needed to maintain the services and functions of Americans depend on daily. I'm going to say that again. CISA provides guidance to support state, local, and industry partners in identifying the critical infrastructure sectors and the essential workers needed to maintain the services and functions Americans depend on daily. So it's the hardware side of infrastructure and the people side of infrastructure. I suspect that got modified during 2020 in the earliest days of COVID, where they added essential workers. I don't know if that's true. That's just my guess. But what do? They take a look at these critical infrastructure sectors, and that is here. The government's been looking at these critical infrastructure sectors and have said, these are the things that make living in America work, right? All the parts of it: financial services, energy, emergency services, food and agriculture, government facilities, healthcare and public health, transportation, nuclear reactors, materials and waste, information technology sectors, dams, defense industrial base, critical manufacturing, chemical sector, commercial facilities, and communications. Notice nothing in here says space. Nothing of these 16 say space. And it has been about 3 years now. I mentioned the Foundation for the Future. They have been really interested in getting space assigned as a critical infrastructure sector. And if that were to happen, it opens up the doors to a lot of existing programs that could help build and protect and expand the space sector. So again, I'm going to encourage y'all to take a look at these sectors. Think about your own lives. Think about how you work in the world, what you do, where you go, where you shop, how you live, and start thinking about how do these various sectors impact your daily life. I'm going to a doctor's tomorrow. It's really nice that they've got healthcare as a critical sector. Hopefully, I don't wind up in an ambulance and the emergency services are not a part of it. I'm going to eat today a couple times. So the food and agriculture sector, pretty important. I did some transactions with my ATM and my phone. I never went to the bank, but it's nice to know those systems are there. So all of these things are part of the stuff that we kind of take for granted, but the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency tries to make sure that all of this stuff works, right? And that adversary nations are not easily able to impact these things. I remember back in my late 20s. This would have been about 1997, perhaps. So maybe I was 30, right at 30. There was a rumor. I never heard whether it was true or not, but given the circles I was running in, I was working at an early internet company back when they still called them .com companies. And there was a strong rumor that some folks had hacked into a dam and were messing around with the turbines and figuring out how to open the gates of a dam. Now, I don't know whether that's true or not. That feels kind of like urban legend now, looking back all those years, 25 years. But it's really nice to me to think that this cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency exists and that they take this stuff very seriously. How does that relate to today's show? Well, I know that there's been a long interest in focusing on these 16 critical infrastructure sectors and adding space as the 17th one. Right now, and this is from the Government Accountability Office. So they've done another study on how all of these parts fit together to make living in America viable. All this infrastructure that we kind of take for granted and is kind of in the background, but necessary for our way of life. And how do we get space listed as the 17th one? Well, because we talk about policy on this show a lot, now understanding that it is not, that space is not considered critical infrastructure, that there are designations for 16 other critical infrastructures. Now let's start looking at this document. We're going to go back to it here. So this is the document from the AIAA's Cislunar Ecosystem Task Force. I have some notes on another page, so if you'll allow me, I'm going to be kind of looking at two screens at once here. I'm going to read off some pieces because I think some of this stuff is pretty important. And we've gotten some comments from our community that the podcast, the Spotify version, is really cool, except that it implies that people are able to read a show that is, consumed audibly. So I'm going to be reading a little bit more here. Spaceports and lighthouses were vital government investments that made crossing the seas and trade economical and safe. Today, spaceports, communications protocols, and GPS satellites are the public assets that play similar roles to enable rocket launches and satellite operation. So that's their basic premise, is that the government already has a history and precedent in making trade economical and safe, crossing the oceans, operating in large rivers, the deltas of between Washington and Oregon come to mind. The deltas in the Mississippi come to mind. The government already has this history of providing seaports and lighthouses as a way to make trade better. And that's their premise. They're saying, look, for clarity of the space economy, we need to have rules in place that people can use. reading more. Focused government investment has long played a key role in economic development and should today guide how U.S. policy approaches Earth and space as a single continuous economy. Now, yeah, this is something you would expect from the AIAA because they want to support the commercialization of space, which, by the way, that by itself is only maybe 6 or 7 years old. The AIAA, when I first got involved with space, was absolutely driven and run by the scientist sector, the scientist community, and folks like me that were pushing commercialization. We were definitely on the outside. We were definitely at the perimeter of that organization. So that they are now issuing documents to the National Chamber of Commerce on the economic development of U.S. policy, and that they approach Earth and space as a single continuous economy. That is bold language. That is new language. It is surprising given the source, but that source has shifted over the last 6 or 7 years. So it's really great to see that. And so they go on to say things like, they reference the 2020 National Space Policy. One of our early shows a while back, we dug deep into that 2020 National Space Policy. It came out towards the end of 2020, so we dug into it in early 2021. Quote, extend human economic activity into deep space by establishing a permanent human presence on the moon. So they're saying, look, this is national policy. This is what the administration is focusing on. Extend human economic activity into deep space by establishing a permanent human presence on the moon. So if that is national policy, how do we focus the economic capabilities of the United States to make that happen, right? Making the Earth and space a single continuous economy, establishing a permanent human presence on the moon. So that's the framework. That's where the AIAA is coming from. And what they want to do, the point of this document, and it's only 2 pages long, so it's a pretty quick read. The point of this document is to shape the policies, but they're not trying to change anything significant. That's what I want to point out. What they're saying is, and this is what the quote from earlier said. Let me come back to it here. Who is this that said this? The guy named Brumley. I don't know who Brumley is. I've lost it. But Brumley says they expected us, I think, to start talking about how the government is not doing enough. We didn't have that view. Our view is that the government had all the resources it needed. What it needed was clarity. Now, I have gone out to many events where policy is being created and built or brainstormed or whatever. And very rarely, maybe never, has anybody said, we got what we need. Everything's fine. We got what we need. This document, and I'm going to skip to a part that's really important, and I'll come back to it as something I'm missing. But Wait a second. The part about clarity. To clarify the inclusion of space in national economic development initiatives, Project Clarity is solely focused on existing traditional economic development programs across government departments and agencies and their potential applicability to space related infrastructure without requiring new funding initiatives, without additional legislative action, and without jeopardizing existing program budgets. So, what they're saying is we kind of have what we need. What currently exists, and that's in this area right here. What currently exists is good enough as long as we apply it to space. And we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail here. But we don't need new money. We don't need any more legislative action. And we're not going to weasel our way into existing budget programs. What this is saying is there's already money, there's already programs, and Congress has already authorized this work. We just want those programs to not just get immediately ignored or overruled if they have the words space in them. So when cities and counties and states are applying for infrastructure funds, for example, an upgraded railroad crossing, where there's a road and power poles and light fixtures and maybe fiber optics and communications underground. When all that stuff comes together, there is money from the state, federal, and local levels. There are infrastructure programs. There's funding, there's legislation, and there's budgets to do that work. And yeah, you got to go through steps. Those steps are Herculean all by themselves. But what this is saying is those programs currently exist, and we just want to apply space to that level of thinking. I think that's pretty cool. I think that's new. I think that's pretty interesting. A few months ago, I was addressing some members of Congress. That's not the same as congressional testimony. I was addressing some members of Congress at a think tank event that Peter Garrettson hosted at the was it American Foreign something Council? Anyway, Garrettson was hosting this event, and they asked me what one thing they could do to just make space a little bit easier, a little bit more accessible. And what I said was, there are lots of SBIR, STTR programs, and some of them for Air Force, for Space Force, a little bit for the Navy, certainly for NASA, and a tiny bit for the National Science Foundation. They all have space elements. But until the Department of Forestry, Bureau of Land Management, National Institute of Health, until all of the government programs that have SBIRs and STTR research funding projects, until all of those accept space, it's always going to be this niche thing. But if I'm a farmer in Iowa and I want to do a research project about using satellites for precision agriculture, there's no way to do that because Department of Ag doesn't have space tech approval. So what this AIAA is saying is like, look, there already are programs out there that are built for infrastructure that we can use to fund space projects. No new money, no new budgets, no new legislative action. We already have the stuff we need. Let's just go do it. So that sounds pretty cool. I like that. But remember, this is an AIAA paper. This is not law. There's no rules. This is just a bunch of smart folks getting together saying, hey, let's figure out how we can use the existing system to build the stuff we want to build. I'm going to read a little further. Pre and post-pandemic economic development funding has been spread across almost all federal departments and agencies with a focus on a broad category of physical infrastructures. Economic development spending also has focused even more specifically on public infrastructures with the express goal of stimulating employment in communities, particularly among the middle class. Since 2021, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act authorized more than $1.5 trillion of spending over the next 10 years. So they're saying, look, there's money out there. How do we get to apply that to space? So, and this is how we're going to wrap up today. They're saying there's kind of three paths. Maybe there's a fourth. We'll talk about that in a minute. The CRS, which I have lost what's here, Congressional Research Service. So I had to look this one up. This one was new to me. Give me a second. Let me throw that in here. Yeah, here we go. I didn't know who this was. There's not a lot of information here, but these folks are a think tank that is funded by Congress for Congress to give representation, our elected representatives, the information they need to make the best decision that they can. The mission: to serve Congress with the highest quality of research, analysis, information, and confidential consultation to support the exercise of its legislative, representational, and oversight duties in its role as a co-equal branch of government. That was super cool. And by the way, I really like to stress that they are a co-equal branch of the government. That's a personal nitpick of mine, that Congress is not subordinate to the president, that the Supreme Court is not subordinate to the president, that those three are co-equal branches of government. I learned that in the 9th grade. I think people forget that all the time, and I think it's super important. But anyway, I'll get off my little soapbox there. The idea that Congress has its own think tank that does research to help it make better decisions, that's a brand new piece of information. I had no idea. This is really cool. I like this. It's worth looking into. But let's get back to our document here. They're saying that the Congressional Research Service, this is where it's at, as a reliable and authoritative source on the depth, breadth, and public policy goals of federal economic development programs, should immediately prioritize analysis of space infrastructure projects and their fit in current federal and state economic policies and programs without additional funding or authorization. Basically, they're just saying, look, CRS, take a look at space, and if you think it's appropriate, just say yes, that these projects fit within the definitions of infrastructure. They're asking the same thing for this other group, again, a group I didn't know anything about, the Administrative Conference of the United States. And they provide a helpful link here. I didn't know anything about these folks either. They are the primary authority for the interpretation of U.S. government administrative and regulatory laws and policies. It is similarly positioned to issue guidance affirming the eligibility of space activities for economic development programs. And they're saying the ABA, the American Bar Association, can also comment on this, right? So that these two together, one is force of law, and one is policy administration, that these two groups together could say, look, let's use the current system of infrastructure, apply it to space, and everybody's going to win. We don't need new money. We don't need new laws. We don't need new legislative actions. We can just take what we currently have and apply it to this new domain, which again comes back to, if space is not considered a critical infrastructure piece, is that enough? The AIAA says, yes, we think it is, but they need these folks to go ahead and agree. And the last one would be the Office of Management and Budget is empowered to take the concrete steps of publishing clarifying guidance for federal departments and agencies regarding the applicability and flexibility of economic development programs to support commercial space economic development. So any of those three agencies could support this. If all three did, it would move us a lot closer to building this out as national critical infrastructure, the 17th element of national critical infrastructure. But whether it became the 17th element or not, having the OMB, the CRS, or the Administrative Conference of the United States, ACUS, any one of those could certify that the rules that are in place for infrastructure could also apply to space. Woof, that's a lot. That is a lot. I hope I didn't go over everybody's head here. I think this stuff is important. I know that our policy shows are our lowest interest shows, lowest attendance, lowest view numbers, lowest comments. I know that all that's true. It's still super important, and we're going to continue doing it. But that said, we've gotten a lot of comments about the defense elements of space, and we're really hoping that show, we're calling it the Space Power Hour. We're hoping that show is pretty intriguing, sparks some important conversations. I definitely have some biases, so I have to be careful about how we present that. But that's where we're going. So that's our show for the evening. Thanks a lot for joining us. We'll be starting the Space Power Hour in probably 2 weeks, maybe a little bit less. Please join us next week on Tuesday. We've got I think we've got, maybe I've got my schedule wrong. We've got the Red Planet Live show with the Mars Society, and then after that, the following week, we come back to the Space Frontier Foundation's Commercial Space Pioneers group. So that's going to be fun. That's going to be great. I've seen some of those episodes already, the ones that are pre-recorded and in development. They're terrific. You're going to like them. I learned some really important stuff out of one of them, so I'll share that later. And with that, we're going to sign off. Y'all have a great day. Good night. Bye-bye.